So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome today's presenter, Jenny Thompson, Vice President with Ipsos's Market Strategy and Understanding team. Jenny, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you who are on the West Coast. Welcome back to those of you who look forward to this webinar year after year, and if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. I hope this session is both inspiring and thought-provoking, perhaps validating some of the trends that you've been observing, and also open your mind to a new perspective on Canadian eating and drinking trends. Now, I've been working on this 5 study since its inception in 2013, and it's true that many of these broader trends are pretty slow moving and evolving over time. But this year, there are some that have demonstrated truly remarkable shifts. And I think what that's reflecting is where we're at in terms of Canadian mindset, how we're adapting to these broader pressures, and just what we're going through overall. And honestly, the last number of years have been like a wild ride. We're rolling into another year of uncertainty. We're in this constant state of flux. Trade wars, global tensions, high cost of living, housing crisis. Quite honestly, I'm getting tired of repeating this narrative, but the reality is we face a plethora of pressures as Canadians. And across many sources, our sentiment among Canadians is really not great, and the outlook continues to look rather bleak. This multitude of pressures is really driving this sense of a feeling of a lack of control. It's like we're on this roller coaster ride that we can't escape. And yet, amidst all of this, there's this shift towards making more deliberate decision making as a means of really trying to regain this control. But if we shift our perspective, a roller coaster can also represent an exciting journey, one of growth and change and resilience. And what we see is this clear connective thread really woven across our eating and drinking patterns. The future of consumption in Canada has really shifted to become much more intentional as we become a lot more thoughtful about our food and beverage choices. So this year marks the 12th edition of our Canada CHATS Trends Report, and we're really diving into a comprehensive exploration of how this intentionality theme is really manifesting itself across a number of food and beverage trends. And much like the theme of a roller coaster, we see 2 of these trends in particular really rising into focus. Value is a big one. It's been a hot topic among our clients today and continues to rise in importance. And then we also see the rise of functional wellness, which we'll talk about today. But then we're also plunging into kind of a revised version of these really ingrained behaviors, things like a new way of looking at indulgence and a more modernized approach to immersive experiences. But then, of course, too, we're also navigating the complexity and twists and turns of topics like conscious sourcing. So these 5 trends really mark the core foundation of our trends report this year. But of course, we're also looking into deep diving into the day part, so breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacking as well. So today's agenda is twofold. I'm first going to ground everybody on what's fueling chats from a data perspective, and then I'm going to spend the rest of the time going through some highlights of the macro trends. So yes, today we are sharing trends, and yes, they are grounded in facts, and quite a lot of them. Our main study 5 is really what's the primary data source that's fueling this trends report, and I'll talk about it a bit in a moment. But there is a whole suite of best-in-class syndicated studies that are really fueling kind of this holistic report in general. So we have our Alcohol Consumption Tracker Act, our Food Service Monitor, FSM, broader kind of picture behavior and sentiment that's being pulled in from our Ipsos Essentials tracking study, as well as Ipsos Context, which is coming from our Public Affairs Division. And then we've woven in a few global trends from the Canadian market perspective as well. What is 5? I really hope that many of you on the call today have either, or at least are aware of it, or if not, have engaged with our team in some shape or form. But for those of you who aren't familiar, 5 is an online diary of what Canadians ate and drank yesterday. You can think of it as the 5 W's of consumption. So the who, the what, the where, the when, and the why. We have been in field for over a decade and launched in 2013, and we're always on. We're in field 24/7, 365 days a year. And so this allows us to capture a really robust sample size every year, and we're capturing among Canadians ages 2 and up. Now, the really rich power that lies in our 5 data set is the fact that we've been in field for a long time. But it's really important that we also continue to evolve this study and really reflect a modernized and pretty complex approach to our eating and drinking patterns. And so we've added a number of modules, we've added a kind of a more robust way of capturing this complexity, some of which I'll touch on today. But we have tons to cover in this short session, so let's just jump right into the trend information. So starting off with value, value has certainly risen its profile lately. I mean, it was once kind of a component or element of a lot of these consumption habits and is now being marked as a standalone trend on its own, and rightfully so. It really represents this shift in how Canadians are defining and pursuing value in their food and beverage choices, and there's just so much nuance here that really requires us to go below surface level. Yes, it's being driven by economic pressures, and consumers are really forced to become more strategic optimizers as it relates to this, but it goes way beyond price, obviously. So let's just start with kind of grounding everyone in terms of where are we from a mindset perspective. If we look ahead to the next 12 months, only 45% of Canadians are optimistic about the near future. So not great, but we are 5 points higher than the global average. So I think that has to count for something. Now, if we look at data from our Ipsos Essentials Tracker, we've been looking at the multitude of risks that we're impacted by. So inflationary pressures and political risk are the top two, and they're growing in year-over-year tracking. Probably not that surprising. But one thing that I continue to keep my eye on is this point, and that 55% of Canadians report that these risks are moderately to highly correlated overall to our overall health and well-being. And I think that's really important to understand because this does have an impact and trickle-down effect to our eating and drinking patterns, and it's growing in year-over-year tracking. We also, maybe a week or so ago, listened to a really interesting, albeit depressing, outlook on Canadian sentiment overall. And this was coming from our public affairs context team. And I mean, as roller coasters are concerned, this chart really depicts the ride that we've been on in terms of how we're feeling about the future and how we're feeling about our country in terms of the direction that it's heading. Probably not surprising to see now 6 in 10 say that we are on the wrong track. So again, not really great. And I think it's really important, and I say this all the time, that this context matters. It matters because we are all consumers in this virtual room today, and all of these things have a trickle-down effect and an impact and influence on our food and beverage choices. But despite the doom and gloom, it's really not necessarily all bad news. When we look at how Canadians are adapting or changing their behaviors to mitigate these cost of living pressures, now 51% say that they are making changes, but it's actually pulled back a little bit compared to last year. We're pretty consistent overall. Our top behavior shifts really look at comparing prices, cooking at home, and visiting food service less often, or changing our dynamics around food service. And if we look at this from a generational perspective, for example, pretty consistently across the board, although there are some nuances, we are pretty much on par with these being the top ranked overall. But there's also a little bit of a YOLO mindset happening here, but kind of like YOLO within our financial means. And by that, I mean, we're seeing that Canadians are actually easing up on some of these behaviors. We're actually showing a bit of a willingness to splurge on a nice meal here or there. We're being a little bit more impulsive, and we're seeing a return to entertaining, although this in itself is shifting, which I'll talk about in one of our trends in a bit. Of course, all of these have implications spanning from the full spectrum of the retail side of things as well as food service. And so it's important to be aware and apprised of all of these shifting behaviors that are happening. So yes, comparing prices more often is still kind of one of those top ranking, or is the top ranking behavior change. But when it comes to value, we obviously can't simply talk about price. And this is where the nuance really comes into play. So in 5, of course, we're talking about Canadian food and beverage consumption. We look at what's called the value trigger. And the value trigger is comprised of 2 key motivations driving what we're actually eating and drinking. That's good value for money and wanting to save money. So overall, this drives a little over a third, 34% of all food and commercial beverage occasions. Interestingly, it's actually a bit softer compared to last year. And maybe that's a bit of a reflection of the kind of lightening up on some of these behavior changes, but nonetheless, it's up compared to 5 years ago, which is no surprise there. But the nuance comes in when we look at it, say, from a generational perspective. So if we look at younger generations, leading Gen Z and millennials with kids, for example, they actually are overdeveloped for the value trigger, whereas boomers, on the other hand, are underdeveloped. It plays a lesser role overall in driving consumption patterns. So that's one way to look at it. Value is also playing out differently as it relates to our food formats. So if we break out the value trigger in terms of the two components, so good value for money and wanting to save money, and look at what's driving this overall from a format perspective, fresh foods are increasingly meeting the need for good value for money, whereas packaged and frozen are increasingly meeting the need for wanting to save money. Now, inherently, frozen foods are always more strongly attributed or more aligned with wanting to save money, but nonetheless, it's important to understand kind of the nuance here from a format perspective. Okay, so what about things like pantry loading or buying things on sale? Yes, these two in particular overall are, more strongly associated with meeting this need around value. But I think something interesting, especially as it relates to this theme of intentionality, is the growth in foods being consumed and that are purchased specifically for a meal or snack occasion. And that's what's fastest growing in terms of meeting the need for value overall. So to me, this says something around the idea of waste reduction, for example, and it could be only buying and consuming things that are needed and not necessarily in excess. So again, there's a lot of complexity happening here as it relates to food format and how we're purchasing and pantry loading our food items. Naturally, Canadians are also shifting our channel and sourcing behavior, and that's really in the search of a better deal. So I mentioned these top behavior changes, and if we look at the association of the value trigger across these, remember cooking at home more often, for example, was number 2. So I would have expected this to be, much strongly indexed, for example, for meeting the needs around value. And it's not strongly over-indexed by any means. It's a little above average. And I think that's interesting to know, especially as it relates to kind of meeting the need for good value for money. But what is more notable is changing grocery stores. So or changing channels in general. So if we look at this behavior change, it's more strongly associated with wanting to save money in particular. And when we look at channels in terms of meeting that need for value overall, discount grocery, obviously, no surprise, number 1, and it's growing, as is Costco. And then we still have mass merch and online kind of rounding out the top ranked, although they have pulled back a little bit in year-over-year tracking. So as value really comes to the forefront, it's definitely become a topic among a lot of our clients, and there's so much opportunity, whether we're looking at the nuanced differences across our suite of food and beverage syndicated studies, but also from a custom lens as well. There is a lot of tools in our toolkit to really help better understand what's going on from a brand or category perspective and how you kind of move forward to really meet the needs of Canadians. Another trend that has gained considerable traction is that of functional health. You can call it mindful nutrition, deliberate wellness, it doesn't matter the term, but it marks our second and perhaps our hottest trend that we've been seeing. This trend is really reflecting a sustained movement towards food and beverages that deliver on a specific added benefit. And it's really being shaped by several converging forces. Things like the rise of highly personalized nutrition, the growing interest in clean labels, of course, the emergence of GLP-1 medications. But I think what this trend is really signaling to me is, in the context of this, sentiment of lack of control, what is something that we actually can control? It's what we put in our bodies. It's how we're fueling ourselves. And I think that this is really something that Canadians are starting to latch on to as a means of really kind of moving ourselves forward in a positive direction as it relates to our overall wellness. So let's start with just a couple of key facts, and these are coming from Global Trends. 82% of Canadians overall agree, I need to do more to look after myself physically. That's a pretty big number. 69% agree, I'd also like to lose some weight. Now, in 5, we track reported conditions as it relates to our health, and weight concerns, stress, and mental health are still the top ranking overall, which is really no surprise there. So we say we want to make changes, but are we actually making conscious steps towards that? Sort of. And in some ways, yes, we are. We are now capturing a new diet and wellness module in our 5 study. And this is really the intention of diving deeper into understanding what is going on in terms of gaining control of our diet and wellness, some of the behavior changes that we're making, and being able to link that to our overall consumption patterns. 26% of Canadians say that they have made changes to their diets in the past 3 months. Now, personally, given the numbers that I just showed you, I actually expected a number like this to be higher, but still 26% is also not insignificant. 61% of Canadians report eating smaller portions than before. Now, this is something to pay attention to, because not only does this impact, how much we're consuming overall, but it does point to, the competitive set and what we're choosing to eat and drink on a daily basis. So I don't believe there's necessarily one singular factor that's driving this, but perhaps maybe a more obvious one, and one that has gained a lot of momentum in terms of, being in the spotlight through the media. And that's, of course, our GLP-1 medications. So we have also added this to our diet and wellness module, where we're able to really capture in detail, not just these key basic metrics, but really understanding the nuanced differences across usage types, and again, tying it to overall consumption patterns. 6% of Canadians overall report taking a GLP-1 medication, and 11% are considering taking one. Now, if we looked at this from a generational perspective, 18% of millennial parents are among the considerers. So it's quite a notable jump among certain cohorts. Overall, the primary reasons really are driven by the management of type 2 diabetes. This still accounts for the largest share, although the management of weight is really kind of closing the gap on that a little bit. And there's some important distinctions across generations. So probably pretty intuitive, but if we look at older generations, they tend to skew towards the primary reason being taking it for the management of type 2 diabetes. Whereas if we look at younger generations, there's much stronger development for taking one of these medications for weight management reasons. And there's so much nuance and so much understanding that goes beyond this that I think is important as we continue to evolve how we're talking about these medications and how we're interacting with consumers who are on them for a variety of reasons. There's also major implications as it relates to what we're eating and our consideration set, because of course they tend to drive appetite suppression. So there's a multitude of factors that are driving what's going on, especially among these type of users. We are also seeing a lot of changes as it relates to our health-centric motivations, and we're becoming hyper-focused on very specific dietary needs. We're seeing growth across the board in things like fits with my diet for a specific health or medical condition, fits with my weight loss diet, helps recover from physical exertion. Now, these are motivations that are tied to the actual consumption of what I choose to eat and drink in any given day. There's also this sustained movement towards fresh, not processed, pure and natural, made with real ingredients. And I think it's important to keep in mind that this is still an underlying driver as we shift towards these health-oriented needs. For me, though, the big question around this is really around sustainability. I mean, we've seen crash diets and fads and stuff, like these aren't new news, but what I see is this collective shift towards the clean and simplicity, really honing in on bettering our health. And again, this idea of what can we actually control. And I believe that this is something that is going to have stickiness and staying power as we move towards the future. Now, when we identify a trend, of course, it's as much about looking at the data and identifying what's going on, but it's also about listening and watching and observing what's going on in the real world. And I think there are some trends that I see that I know intuitively are happening, but then to see it reflected so profoundly in the data, it really underlines to me the importance of these trends. And this one is really around the clean label and label scrutiny movement. So we track label reading behavior as it relates to the nutrition facts table, so back panel, as well as the ingredients label, so the list of ingredients contained. And I mean, if you just look at these charts, we could go way back to 2013, and it's been relatively stable over the last 10 years. But to see this jump in year-over-year tracking is quite remarkable. And I think this is a true reflection of what is going on among Canadians. And I do believe that there is a lot being fueled by social media, for example, and what's going on just generally speaking in the world. Of course, when we look at some of the more prominent items on the nutrition facts table, there's two in particular that are gaining a lot of attention. Protein, obviously a huge one, which resonates more among Gen Z in particular, for example. And millennial parents are increasingly scrutinizing the ingredients list, so what's actually in our products. We obviously have named this trend functional wellness for a reason, and that's because we're seeing this growth in terms of a share of occasions that are driven by a specific nutritional or metabolic driver. So overall, 53% of meals and snacks are driven by any given one of these nutritional or metabolic drivers. Tends to weigh heavier during meal occasions, but still a sizable number that are driving snack occasions as well. So what are these needs? There's a whole laundry list. Anything from clean intake to mood improvement, disease prevention and gut health, weight control, muscle tone and recovery, there's your protein, and all the way down to things like advanced hydration and sleep improvement. And if we look at this across the board, there are so many differences, whether it's by generation, by gender, across foods and beverages. And we really continue to see not only this, explosion of innovation. I mean, all you have to do is walk into a store to the natural health aisle or into a health food store, and the shelves are packed with this blurring of category lines, whether it's, supplements and blending with actual food and beverage products, or this blending and blurring of the lines of categories, and not necessarily clear distinction of a beverage versus a caffeine drink versus a water and so on. And so this is certainly something that we will continue to try and track and understand the complexities of how consumers are choosing these type of functional products. Because quite frankly, we are so beyond generic wellness, and the future is definitely functional. On this roller coaster journey, I mean, so far we've kind of experienced a lot of these rising trends that are coming into focus, but there's also this idea of plunging into new versions of old habits. There are still very ingrained behaviors in our everyday consumption patterns, and this one in particular really reveals how Canadians are redefining pleasure in an era of health consciousness as well as economic pressures. No, we are not abandoning indulgence, but we are becoming more strategic about when, about how, and what we choose to indulge in. Yes, these true moments of indulgence still exist. They're not going anywhere. And this trend certainly isn't about giving up pleasure, but it's about making these moments much more intentional. If we look at our core motivations overall, so all foods and commercial beverages, all occasions, total population, our top ranked need states are comfort cravings, tasty indulgence, and convenience. These are at its core what's driving our top needs overall. You can see that tasty indulgence has pulled back, same with convenience and year-over-year tracking. Comfort cravings has pretty much stayed stable. But to me, what really kind of raises flags are what's fastest growing. And there's a clear theme here, things like social confidence, dietary intake, energy boost. So I hope you can see this kind of clear thread that's being woven through as we're still maintaining our core needs, but there's a shift into a little bit of a change as it relates to intentionality in our overall health and well-being. So I mentioned earlier this dramatic rise in label reading scrutiny, and it's even happening when we look at these indulgent occasions. So if we look at within the lens of a tasty indulgence occasion, there's still notable growth of reading the nutrition facts table as well as the ingredients label, and that's up 9 and 8 points in year-over-year tracking. So even during these indulgent occasions, consumers are still ranking calories as the most important. That's not really new. That's always number one across the board. But sugar and sodium are still number 2 and 3 as it relates to, most important items during these tasty indulgence occasions. So, obviously whether we're choosing a sweet or a savory one, this might change, but it still underlines the importance of the fact that there is this label reading behavior and scrutiny happening even within these type of occasions. And then we also see things like protein and ingredients, the added benefits and so on kind of coming through and playing out even during these occasions. We're also seeing that while true indulgence still account for 2 and 10 overall, it's these everyday indulgences that have really started to gain momentum over the last number of years. So if we look compared to 5 years ago, or even compared to pre-pandemic periods, it's the everyday indulgences that are growing in particular. And even if we look at, say, among those who are on a GLP-1 medication, for example, they fall in line with the total population in terms of consuming everyday indulgences. So they're not necessarily foregoing this behavior altogether. In fact, they're very much in line with the total population overall. Now, there are some cohorts in particular that are driving this, generations like older Gen Z, millennials without kids, and boomers as well. Of course, there are some foods and beverages that are being saved for maybe more truly indulgence occasions. So if we look at top unique foods by occasion, everyday indulgences overdeveloped are things like ice cream, cheese, cookies, potato chips, chocolate. Then if we look at special indulgence occasions, we see, slight nuances, frozen novelties, French fries, pizza. And then there's some categories like ice cream and chocolate that are playing on both ends of this. But I think if we look below the surface, I would expect to see format differences, maybe a bit more premiumness in terms of needs and brands, maybe falling in the special indulgence category. But nonetheless, there's this opportunity to really kind of peel apart and understand where does your category and brand fit, and how does it best meet the needs of these particular occasions. On the beverages side, maybe a little bit more intuitive, not really surprising to see special indulgence really being centered around beverage alcohol, so things like beer, wine, and spirits in particular. But seeing things like hot brewed coffee as an everyday indulgence, same with carbonated soft drinks, and then maybe not as surprising to see specialty hot coffee really meeting these needs. So it's gaining this understanding of, where your categories and brands are fitting, how do you position, how do you message, and then find that right balance through the lens of, the shifting meaning of indulgence and the fact that it's leaning a little bit more towards the everyday and a little bit more better for you, but it's still within the context of, this core need for indulging. This next trend is another one where at its core, this desire for emotional connection and experiences, it hasn't gone away. Of course, we are innately social creatures, but how we are immersing ourselves in experiences, it has shifted. This trend really showcases how Canadians are actively curating more meaningful food and beverage moments across both at-home and away-from-home venues. And what we've seen is this real blurring of the lines, especially with food service. And it's really about how we're intentionally curating and crafting these experiences that create a connection and also transcend these traditional dining boundaries. So from a sourcing perspective, overall, we've kind of stabilized a bit in terms of the share of sourcing foods and beverages from retail versus food service. So yes, we peaked during the pandemic where we were highly homebound in terms of benefiting retail, but we've pretty much stabilized now over the last few years, and we're sitting at 83% of occasions overall where foods and commercial beverages are being sourced from retail. But it's not all bad news for food service. We're seeing food service dollars grow, and that's probably a reflection of the sustained rise in menu prices, of course, but there's also positive momentum happening for food service traffic overall. If we look at the order channel, takeout still drives the largest share, but we are seeing share shifts benefit dine-in traffic, for example, and that's coming away from drive-through a little bit. What's also interesting is to add on the layer of third-party apps. So 63% of food service patrons overall are ordering through a third-party platform. Things like Skip the Dishes, Uber Eats, for example. And of those, 40% are leveraging them at least once per month. So to me, this really signals this habitual integration into our dining choices and how we're kind of navigating food service as we move towards the future. Now, adding on to this, there's another interesting dynamic, and that's this slow, sustained movement towards solo eating and drinking. If we look past or back towards pre-pandemic periods, we have slowly increased and are increasingly consuming alone. But are we truly alone? Maybe not necessarily. If we look at among those who are consuming alone, there is a strong index in scrolling behavior. So we're on our phones. And I mean, this is really particularly resident among Gen Z, who are obviously constantly curating and sharing their experiences with hundreds or thousands or even more if you're an influencer, all while being at home alone behind the screen. And of course, this has implications as it relates to packaging, to format, to preparation dynamics, to our consideration set. This is also a shift that we're seeing in terms of our beverage alcohol consumption occasions. Now, largely and innately beverage alcohol is consumed with others, but still 39% of occasions overall are when we are alone. Now, beer and spirits are increasingly being consumed during social occasions, while wine is being increasingly consumed when we're alone. And this dynamic continues to shift as we see growth towards solo or small group consumption occasions when we're talking about beverage alcohol. So this really changes how we're approaching our communication and our positioning around alcohol consumption. And of course, this is still within that overarching shift towards moderation in general. And if you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend looking at or rewatching the Toast webinar. Sam on our ACT team has put together a fantastic overview of what's going on and a much deeper lens into beverage alcohol consumption. These shifting sourcing and solo and social dynamics also bring to light this opportunity for a more modernized approach to immersive experiences. And we've identified kind of three broader groups or occasions as it relates to this. Solo savoring, which really looks at alone consumption that can happen pretty much anywhere and at home or away from home. Then we look at help me host occasions. These are social occasions that are happening whether you're hosting at your own home or at someone else's home. And then we also look at communal dining experiences. So these are largely happening outside of the home with others. And while myself, for example, could participate in any one of these given occasions at any time during the week, there are some generations that skew a little bit more towards these. So for example, millennials without kids and Gen X are leaning more towards solo savoring. Help me host really kind of revolves much more around millennial families and boomers. And these communal dining experiences out in our community really lend itself to leading Gen Z as well as millennials without kids. Now, another really interesting pattern that we're seeing is this blurring of the lines with food service and the role that it plays during these occasions. So if we look at the sourcing for food service for each of these occasions, it represents 55% of all communal experiences. And these occasions, though, while of course they're happening away from home, and logically this makes sense that they're sourcing from food service more so relative to the others, they're actually driven by lunch and daytime snacking occasions. For solo savoring, 14% of these occasions are being sourced from food service, and it's largely centered around snacking occasions. Help me host, 11% are being sourced from food service, and this really centers around that dinner occasion. And while it's much less compared to some of the others, it still signals to me this interesting intertwined kind of connection of, okay, are we leveraging food service to really elevate the experience here, or are we trying to recreate that food service experience at home to really elevate our overall occasion? And so there's a lot of interesting nuanced dynamics that are happening here to really further understand. And then another interesting element that we layer on top of it is, okay, well, what are we inspired to create in terms of these dishes? And for communal dining experiences, almost half are being driven by a multicultural inspired dish. And that to me signals the need to understand the taste profiles and preferences, what kind of foods are being consumed, the preparation dynamics, and so on. Our last roller coaster ride really kind of showcases this, twists and turns that we're going through and navigating the complexity, and that being the topic of ESG. Conscious sourcing has evolved to become a multi-layered movement where our environmental values are also intersecting with economic and political considerations in pretty complex ways. This traditional movement towards local has found new momentum, obviously, with the Made in Canada and Elbows Up movement, but it's being powered by more than just the carbon footprint reduction. There's also supply chain disruption, which is really forcing Canadians to confront the reality that conscious sourcing often comes with a premium pricing, as well as creating tensions between making decisions based on value and affordability. So I think it's also important to acknowledge that there are many other priorities that are, taking center stage as a focus for Canadians, but this is still a trend that warrants our attention, especially as we're looking ahead towards the future. There is still climate consensus in Canada, and 71% say that, or they agree, we are headed towards environmental disaster if we don't do something about it. But that's actually softened in year-over-year tracking compared to 2024. Now in 5, we've added new questions around, well, what kind of consumer do you consider yourself as it relates to sustainability and sustainable products? And almost 6 in 10 say that they are concerned and active as it relates to this type of behavior. Not surprising to see the stronger indexing or stronger rates among both millennials and Gen Z, but still not insignificant among boomers. But it's complicated, and our intentions are there, but our actions aren't necessarily following through. And I think that's a real reflection of the fact that our dollar simply doesn't go as far as it used to. 19% of respondents say, I am purchasing more foods and beverage brands, or more food and beverage brands that demonstrate sustainable practices, but that's dropped 9 points compared to last year. 38% of respondents are willing to pay a premium for products that demonstrate environmentally friendly practices, but again, that's declined in year-over-year tracking. There are some elements of ESG where we are continuing to put our money where our mouth is, and that's on the Made in Canada movement. So we've been tracking the Made in Canada label since 2013, and it remains the #1 label pretty much across the board. There are, of course, nuanced differences by category and by generation, but broadly speaking, it's #1. We have seen, if we look on a month-by-month basis over the last year, a pretty sustained rise overall, almost 2.5 points compared to August last year in terms of the Made in Canada label on foods in particular. And if we look at, generationally speaking, what's driving the growth, boomers, no surprise, we see the most accelerated growth. They've really latched on to the elbows up movement, and this is inherently important among this generation. And same to a certain extent among Gen X. They tend to lean a little bit more closely aligned with boomers. But Gen Z is up 3 points. And to me, that really signals perhaps this intentional change towards making choices and things that they can control and feel like they can make a difference. Because inherently, they've been a little bit more indifferent to the claim overall. Now, the complexity kind of continues when we start to peel apart this follow through in terms of Made in Canada. And what we can do is look at what we call the say-do gap. So among Canadians who prioritize local, we then look at, okay, well, what are you consuming that actually has the Made in Canada labels on foods and beverages that you're consuming? So if we look at boomers, for example, interestingly, now these guys are the ones that are most strongly kind of influenced and who are really following through on this. There's differences between foods and beverages. There's a much stronger index among Made in Canada foods compared to Made in Canada beverages. Whereas if we look at Gen X, for example, there's a strong indexing for Made in Canada foods, pretty much on par with boomers, but there's a much stronger index on Made in Canada beverages. Then if we shift over to younger generations, while we have seen accelerated growth in terms of consuming those Made in Canada foods, they are still largely underdeveloped. And I think that's important to note the differences here between, what's resonating more with older consumers compared to younger. And then if we look at various kind of big bucket categories in terms of how important is buying Canadian, produce is #1, followed by packaged goods, and then thirdly, commercial beverages, and that's excluding alcohol. But on the younger generation side, there is still a lot of follow through, and that's as it relates to specific label claims, ESG-related label claims on packaged foods. So this looks at through the lens of those consumers who say, top 2 box, I am concerned and an active individual as it relates to sustainability. And if we look at, okay, well, what is overdeveloped as far as these ESG label claims are concerned, and this is on actual consumption behavior, the younger generations have a pretty low say-do gap. So they're following through on this. They're consuming foods that have farmed responsibly, grass-fed meats, recyclable or compostable, organic or plant-based. You can see there's a much longer list of specific claims. But if we look on the other end of the age spectrum, Made in Canada, the older generations are really kind of sitting in a very specific bucket. So they're not necessarily following through on all of these other kind of broader ESG-related claims. So the implication here is really to understand your audience, understand your target. what really resonates with them, and what are the kind of key messaging that you're going to push forward to really, maintain that authentic connection with consumers. Okay, we have arrived at the end of our hypothetical roller coaster ride for today's session. Are you feeling windblown, perhaps terrified, or a little bit exhilarated? Hopefully all of the above. But in all seriousness, there's a lot of external pressures that we simply can't avoid. And more importantly, we should be up to speed on them. As I mentioned earlier, this contextual importance of understanding really has the trickle-down effect as it relates to our eating and drinking patterns. But let's let this shift towards intentionality be an uplifting message. There is so much opportunity to support consumers and really help facilitate more moments of joy and connection through immersive experiences, for example, or really empower them as far as making decisions that relate to our overall health and well-being. Because honestly, as cheesy as it sounds, life is really a roller coaster, so we better buckle up and enjoy the ride. That's all I have for today. Thank you so much, everyone. And I will now just check quickly if we have any questions before we wrap up, because I know we're very close on time. Okay, so there's a question here around the front of pack nutrition labels. So yes, have we noticed a shift? So the question is, with the front of pack nutrition labels starting to roll out, have we noticed any shifts or chatter around this? This is a really good question. So we've actually been tracking this for a number of years to try and understand, what's really going on in terms of consumption. How is this influencing consumers? And what we've noticed is that among those who are already label readers, it doesn't really seem to have an impact. If I'm already kind of adopting this behavior, and this is already ingrained in terms of my consumption patterns, the added label claim, front of pack label claims are not really adding much to it or influencing much in terms of our decision to purchase or consume. It is, though, influencing more strongly those who don't currently have that behavior. So among those who aren't label reading, when they're seeing these new front of pack label warnings or label claims, they are more influenced to change maybe their decision to purchase and then consume. So yes, this is something that we can look at in our study across different categories and across consumer types. So there's lots that we can dig into there. Okay, we are at time. Ellen, I will pass it back to you to wrap up for today.
Well, it goes without saying, Jenny, that there's a whole bunch of questions that you are going to have to start responding to because everyone is really resonating with the presentation you gave today. So thank you so much. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Jenny will be responding to your question by email. In the meantime, though, don't forget there are some handouts in the control panel that you can download to learn more about the research we shared today. Be on the lookout for a link to the recording, which should probably be available by tomorrow. That now concludes today's amazing webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.